From 1940 to 1945, Germany faced an unrelenting series of bombing raids that would eventually change the course of World War II. These raids were part of a larger Allied strategy designed to weaken Nazi Germany's ability to wage war by targeting its industrial capacity and infrastructure. The primary goal was simple: destroy Germany's factories, supply lines, and transportation systems. The United Kingdom and the United States carried out the bulk of these bombing campaigns, which intensified as the war wore on. The first large-scale raids against Germany came in the early 1940s. At that time, the German military was at its peak. Its forces controlled much of Europe, and the factories in Germany's industrial heartland, such as those in the Ruhr Valley, produced the weapons and equipment that fueled the Nazi war machine. The Allies knew that taking out these factories could have a profound impact on Germany's war effort. In the early stages, British bombers, such as the Lancaster, carried out night raids over German cities. Their target was clear: the Ruhr Valley, home to coal mines, steel plants, and weapons factories. Cities like Essen, Dortmund, and Dusseldorf housed the critical infrastructure that powered Germany's military. These bombings were designed to destroy or severely disrupt production, but precision targeting was not yet possible. The bombers flew in groups, often at night, to minimize the risk from German fighter planes. However, the early raids caused minimal damage. While some factories were destroyed, the bombing had little lasting impact on Germany's ability to produce weapons. The German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, quickly adapted to the threat. The German air defense system became more sophisticated. Anti-aircraft guns were placed in key positions to shoot down bombers, and the Luftwaffe itself launched numerous counterattacks. They used fast-moving fighters to intercept Allied bombers, but they did not always succeed in stopping the raids. As the war continued, the Allies adjusted their tactics. The raids became larger, involving hundreds of bombers. By 1942, the British Royal Air Force, RAF, began focusing more on area bombing. The goal was no longer to target specific factories, but to destroy entire cities. The hope was that the widespread damage would cripple the German economy and break civilian morale. The first major example of this shift came with the bombing of the city of Cologne in May 1942. It was the first major raid of the war to involve heavy bombing of an entire city. The attack left Cologne in ruins, and it was only the beginning. The bombing campaign expanded quickly. Throughout 1943, large-scale raids hit more cities, including Hamburg. This city's destruction was particularly devastating. In what became known as Operation Gemara, the Allies dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Hamburg, creating a firestorm. The heat from the fires was so intense that it sucked the air out of the city, creating winds strong enough to lift cars into the air. By the end of the raid, the entire city center had been destroyed. Thousands of civilians died, and the German industrial infrastructure in Hamburg was severely damaged. From that point on, the strategy of area bombing became the main focus of the Allies. The United States, which had joined the war in late 1941, joined in with its own bombing campaigns. The U.S. Army Air Force, USAF, focused more on daylight raids, which were intended to target military factories and other industrial sites with greater precision. However, these raids came with heavy losses. German fighters shot down many bombers, and the USAF faced difficulty in hitting their targets with precision. The bombing campaign continued to escalate. By 1944, the Allies had established air superiority over much of Western Europe. German air defenses had been weakened, and the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of defending its skies as effectively as it once had. This allowed the Allies to push deeper into German territory. One of the most infamous raids occurred in February 1945, when the Allies bombed Dresden. The city was known for its cultural landmarks, but it also housed factories that produced military equipment. The raid was particularly devastating. Over a period of 2 days, the Allies dropped massive amounts of bombs, including incendiaries, causing fires that engulfed the city. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the firestorm. The destruction was so complete that it raised questions after the war about the justification for such a large-scale attack on a civilian city. However, the Allies' primary aim remained the same: to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and weaken its ability to fight. Throughout the bombing campaign, German civilians were caught in the crossfire. As bombs rained down on their cities, millions of Germans were forced to take shelter in underground bunkers. Families hid together, hoping to survive the next raid. Many cities were reduced to rubble. The psychological toll on civilians was immense. People became increasingly desensitized to the sound of sirens and the sight of their cities burning. Despite this, the German population continued to work in the factories, producing weapons and supplies for the military. Even as their cities were bombed, the German workforce, including forced laborers, worked long hours to maintain the flow of production. For the German military, the bombing raids created a sense of urgency. The High Command knew that the Allies were systematically crippling their war economy, but they struggled to find an effective response. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered and overextended, and German fighters could not keep up with the relentless raids. The war effort became increasingly defensive, as resources were diverted from offensive operations to air defense and rebuilding efforts. The strategic consequences of these raids were clear. German industry was severely disrupted. The Allies' bombing campaign had successfully damaged or destroyed factories that produced weapons, tanks, and airplanes. The Ruhr Valley, once the heart of German industrial might, was now a shadow of its former self. The bombings also disrupted the transportation networks that moved supplies and military equipment across the country. This made it harder for German forces to resupply their troops on the front lines, particularly as the Allies began their push into Western Europe in 1944. By 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse. The bombing raids had weakened the country's ability to continue the war. The economy was in ruins, and military production had ground to a halt. The final blow came with the Allied invasion of Germany from the west, which followed months of relentless bombing. The bombing campaign had paved the way for the eventual Allied victory, but it had also left a trail of destruction that would take Germany years to recover from. As the war ended in 1945, Germany was left to pick up the pieces. The bombing raids had changed the landscape of the country, physically and economically. Factories were gone, cities lay in ruins, and the German people were left to rebuild what had been lost. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved its goal of crippling the German war effort, but it had come at a significant cost. Millions of lives had been lost, and Germany was left to grapple with the aftermath. The primary objective of the Allied strategic bombing campaign was to cripple the German war effort by destroying its industrial infrastructure. This included factories, transportation hubs, and supply lines that were crucial to the production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions. The Allies aimed to target the heart of Germany's economy, focusing on regions like the Ruhr Valley, which housed key industrial complexes. The belief was that by crippling the ability to produce weapons and materials, Germany's military would be deprived of the necessary resources to continue fighting. In the early stages of the bombing campaign, the Allies used precision bombing to target specific industrial sites. However, as the war progressed, the challenges of accuracy became clear. Factors such as weather conditions, the evolving strength of German air defenses, and the limitations of bombing technology led the Allies to shift tactics. Precision bombing became increasingly difficult, and the decision was made to adopt area bombing instead. This approach aimed to destroy entire neighborhoods, including factories and transportation infrastructure, rather than attempting to hit specific targets. The goal was to create widespread destruction, both in terms of physical damage and disruption to the economy. To carry out these large-scale bombing campaigns, the Allies relied on heavy bombers, which were specially designed to carry significant payloads over long distances. The British Lancaster and the American B-17 Flying Fortress were central to the bombing efforts. These bombers were heavily armed, with crews that included gunners to defend against enemy fighter aircraft. They were equipped with bombs that could create devastating destruction when dropped on key industrial targets. The payloads were often a combination of high-explosive bombs, designed to create massive explosions, and incendiary bombs, meant to start fires that could ravage entire cities. One of the key tactical decisions made by the Allies was to conduct bombing raids at night. The rationale behind this was simple. Night raids made it more difficult for German fighter planes to intercept the bombers. German air defenses were more effective during daylight hours, when fighter planes could easily spot and engage bombers. By flying under the cover of darkness, Allied bombers could avoid detection and increase their chances of reaching their targets. However, night bombing did have its challenges. The bombers often had to rely on basic navigation tools, making it difficult to accurately pinpoint their targets. As the war progressed, technological advancements helped improve the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. Radar and improved navigation systems became increasingly important. Radar allowed bombers to detect enemy aircraft and avoid potential threats. It also helped improve navigation by giving pilots a more reliable means of determining their position, especially in poor visibility conditions. Despite these advancements, however, precision bombing was never fully achieved. The bombers still relied on visual sighting and basic targeting systems, and hitting specific industrial targets with a high degree of accuracy remained a significant challenge. In addition to technological improvements, the Allies began using more sophisticated tactics to increase the effectiveness of their raids. The use of incendiary bombs became more common, especially in densely populated industrial areas. The idea behind these bombs was to start fires that would spread quickly, causing widespread destruction across a large area. In cities like Hamburg and Dresden, incendiary bombs created firestorms, with temperatures so high that they could destroy buildings, machinery, and transportation infrastructure. The intensity of these fires not only caused immense physical damage but also disrupted the economy, as factories and supply lines were destroyed. Despite the technological advancements and changes in tactics, the Allied bombing campaign was far from perfect. The bombers faced significant risks, both from enemy fighters and from anti-aircraft artillery. The German Luftwaffe launched numerous counterattacks, trying to stop the bombers from reaching their targets. Many bombers were shot down, and the crews faced constant danger. Still, the Allies persisted, and as the war progressed, the bombing raids became larger and more frequent. With the loss of German air superiority and the growing scale of the attacks, the Allies were able to intensify their efforts, bringing more and more German industrial centers to their knees. The strategic bombing campaign, with its focus on destroying industrial infrastructure and disrupting the German economy, played a significant role in the eventual Allied victory. While the bombings were far from perfect, they had a lasting impact on Germany's ability to continue the war. The destruction of factories, transportation networks, and supply lines contributed to the weakening of Germany's war machine, eventually making it impossible for the country to sustain its military operations. At the start of the bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe posed a strong defense against the Allied bombers. The German Air Force relied on its fleet of fighter planes to intercept and shoot down bombers before they could reach their targets. The Luftwaffe was well-equipped and experienced, having spent years engaging in aerial combat across Europe. They used their fighters to form defensive screens around key cities, trying to block the bombers and force them to turn back. Along with fighter planes, the Germans had an extensive network of anti-aircraft artillery, known as Flak, positioned along the coastlines and in major cities. The flak guns were designed to fire explosive shells at high altitudes, creating a deadly barrage aimed at destroying bombers in flight. In addition to these defenses, the Germans used radar systems to detect incoming bombers. This technology gave them an early warning, allowing them to scramble fighters and adjust flak positions to intercept the bombers. The Germans also used a system of searchlights to help spot the bombers, especially during night raids. Their efforts were effective in the early years of the campaign, and many bombers were shot down before they could reach their targets. The Luftwaffe's fighters and air defenses posed a serious threat to the Allied bombing campaign, and for a time it seemed that the Germans might be able to stop the raids. However, the Allies adapted. They understood that they had to change their tactics if they were to break through the German defenses. One of the first adjustments they made was to increase the altitude at which they flew. Bombers had initially flown at lower altitudes, where their targets were more visible, but this made them easy targets for German fighters. By flying at higher altitudes, bombers could avoid much of the enemy's flak and fighter defenses. However, this tactic came with its own challenges. At higher altitudes, bombers were harder to target with precision, and visibility was limited, especially at night. This forced the Allies to rely on other technologies, such as radar and navigation systems, to stay on course and target their bombs more effectively. Despite the higher altitudes, the Germans continued to adapt. They developed better anti-aircraft guns, radar-controlled fire, and methods to track bombers at long distances. The Luftwaffe fighters also improved, developing new strategies and tactics to intercept bombers more effectively. However, even with these adjustments, the Allies' numbers and resources were starting to give them the upper hand. The Luftwaffe's ability to defend the skies was gradually worn down, and the bomber raids became more frequent and more devastating. As the war went on, the Allies began to shift their tactics further. The initial aim of the raids was to destroy specific military-industrial targets, but as the bombing campaign expanded, precision targeting became more difficult. This led to a shift toward area bombing, where entire cities or industrial areas were targeted, regardless of the precise location of military factories. The decision to use area bombing was driven by the need to disrupt the German war economy more broadly, as well as to break the spirit of the civilian population. The Allies hoped that by destroying not only military targets but also civilian infrastructure, they could create widespread chaos and force the Germans to divert their resources from military operations to rebuilding efforts. One of the first and most significant examples of this change in tactics came in 1943 with the bombing of Hamburg, known as Operation Gemara. The city was home to key factories that produced military goods, but it was also a major port city, a transportation hub, and a center of industrial activity. The bombing raids on Hamburg were designed not only to damage its factories but also to inflict maximum damage on the civilian population. This would have a twofold effect. It would hinder German military production and at the same time reduce the morale of the population. The raids on Hamburg were dramatic. They involved both British and American bombers, which dropped thousands of bombs over several nights. The bombs included incendiaries, designed to start fires across the city. These fires combined to create a massive firestorm, a phenomenon where the heat from the flames creates powerful winds, drawing in oxygen and intensifying the fire. The firestorm in Hamburg was so intense that it created hurricane-like winds that destroyed entire districts. Buildings collapsed, and entire neighborhoods were engulfed by flames. The heat was so intense that it killed thousands of people, while others perished in the chaos and destruction. The impact of the raids was devastating, not only on the city's infrastructure but also on its population. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and large sections of the city were reduced to rubble. The attack on Hamburg became a model for later raids on other German cities, including Dresden. The Allies had found a new way to break the German war effort by targeting civilian areas with overwhelming force. The strategy of area bombing aimed to make cities uninhabitable, disrupt the flow of goods and resources, and force the German people into a state of fear and despair. As the war entered its final stages in 1944, the Allies ramped up their bombing efforts. The opening of the Second Front in Normandy in June 1944 allowed the Allies to establish a foothold in Western Europe. With the liberation of France and the continued advance of Allied forces, the bombing raids on Germany intensified. Bombers began to target not only key industrial cities but also more central locations in Germany, including the capital, Berlin. In early 1945, the Allies set their sights on Dresden, a city that had been largely untouched by previous bombing raids. Dresden was known for its cultural significance and was an important transportation hub, though it wasn't a major industrial target. The decision to bomb Dresden has remained controversial to this day. The city was bombed heavily by both British and American bombers, with the goal of breaking German morale and disrupting the transportation routes that connected the eastern and western parts of the country. Over 2 days, the city was bombed repeatedly, causing a massive firestorm. As in Hamburg, the heat generated by the fires created deadly winds that destroyed buildings and killed thousands of civilians. The final death toll remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from 25,000 to 100,000 people. The bombing of Dresden was one of the most dramatic and controversial moments in the entire bombing campaign. Many questioned the necessity of bombing a city that wasn't a major military target and was filled with civilians. The intensity of the attack and the civilian casualties it caused raised moral questions that continue to be debated. Yet, in the context of the war, the Allies saw it as a necessary part of their strategy to bring Germany to its knees. As the war neared its end, The bombing campaign had shifted from a precise attempt to target military assets to an overwhelming strategy of destruction. The raids grew larger and more intense, aiming to destroy the German war machine and break the will of the civilian population. While these bombings were controversial, they played a key role in weakening Germany's ability to continue the war and hastening the end of the conflict. For German civilians, the bombing raids were a constant, terrifying presence. In the early days of the air campaign, many had no idea how widespread the destruction would become. The first raids were sporadic, but as the war progressed, they became more frequent and intense. The shock of these attacks set the tone for the experience of millions. Families huddled in underground shelters, hoping to avoid the bombs that fell day and night. They could hear the rumble of the bombers overhead, followed by the sound of explosions as bombs tore through the city. For many, the shelter became a temporary refuge from the chaos above. But the raids rarely lasted only a few minutes. In the dead of night or at dawn, when the bombers came, civilians were forced to endure hours of terror as the bombs rained down. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden, the attacks had a profound effect on the civilian population. The once thriving industrial cities became unrecognizable as fires raged through buildings, streets, and neighborhoods. Families were forced to flee their homes, leaving behind the lives they had built. Many sought safety in smaller towns or rural areas, but there was nowhere to escape the reach of Allied bombers. As the raids continued, thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and many more lost their homes. The destruction was so widespread that entire districts were wiped off the map. The survivors often found themselves living in temporary shelters or makeshift homes, waiting for the bombings to end, knowing that it could happen again at any moment. For those who stayed behind, the constant threat of attack meant that daily life was no longer possible in the way it once had been. The economy had collapsed, and the infrastructure of the cities had been severely damaged. The sound of sirens became a regular part of life, signaling that a new raid was imminent. People could do little but hide and hope they would survive. In some cities, like Berlin, the bombings were so constant that many civilians became numb to the destruction. The once beautiful streets, parks, and buildings were reduced to rubble. People were left with the grim task of picking up the pieces, knowing that they had no way of stopping the onslaught. As the war dragged on, the civilian population was also forced to participate in the effort to rebuild. In many bombed-out cities, civilians were pressed into service to repair the damage caused by the raids. Forced labor became a reality for many, as the German war machine struggled to maintain its output. In some areas, men, women, and even children were required to work in factories or construction sites, rebuilding what had been destroyed by the bombings. This was not only physically exhausting but emotionally draining. For many, there was no escape from the war. The lines between the front line and civilian life blurred as the bombings continued. At the same time, some civilians were pushed into service to defend their cities from the advancing Allied forces. With the loss of much of the German army and the increasing presence of Allied troops on the Western Front, many civilians were called up to fight. Some were sent to man air defense systems while others were trained to fight on the ground. As Allied bombers flew over, they could see German civilians working to fight back. But with the continued bombing raids, it was clear that the war had reached a new level of devastation for the average German citizen. Factory workers, including women and forced laborers, experienced a different kind of pressure. The war economy relied heavily on factories to produce the tanks, planes, and weapons needed for the battlefield. Even as the bombs fell, the need for production never stopped. Factory workers often found themselves working in conditions that were far from ideal. As bombs dropped around them, they were expected to keep working, producing materials that would fuel the German military effort. Many workers had no choice but to continue their labor under these hazardous conditions. The threat of air raids hung over them like a dark cloud, and the noise of the bombers was ever present. For many, working in a factory during the bombing raids was a dangerous proposition. Some workers continued to work in buildings that had been partially damaged by previous attacks, putting themselves at risk. Others worked in factories that were directly targeted by Allied bombers, knowing that they could be killed at any moment. The emotional toll was significant. In some cases, workers were forced to continue laboring through the night, with no guarantee of safety. As the bombs fell, the workers could only hope that their factory would remain intact long enough for them to finish their shift. The workers who had been pressed into service, often from occupied countries, found themselves in even more difficult situations. They had little control over their working conditions, and many were treated as expendable. They worked long hours in dangerous environments with no regard for their well-being. For those who had been forced into labor, survival became a daily struggle. They were often subjected to poor living conditions and treated harshly by the factory owners or Nazi officials. The factories, like the cities, were constantly under threat, and the workers had no choice but to continue producing. On the other side of the conflict, the Allied aircrews faced their own set of challenges. Their missions were fraught with danger from start to finish. Flying into enemy territory meant dealing with a constant threat of being shot down. The bombers flew in tight formations to maximize their defensive capabilities, but this also made them easy targets for German fighters. The bombers were equipped with heavy defensive armament, and the crew members, including gunners, worked to protect the aircraft from enemy fire. But despite their defenses, the bombers were not invincible. The Luftwaffe's fighters targeted the bombers relentlessly, and many Allied airmen never made it back. The emotional impact of these bombing runs was complex. On one hand, the crews understood that their mission was critical to the war effort. They were carrying out orders to strike at Germany's industrial heartland, hoping to weaken the Nazi war machine. But on the other hand, the airmen had to grapple with the human cost of their missions. Many of them could see the devastation they caused from the air, watching entire cities burn and knowing that their bombs had killed thousands of civilians. The tension between the military objective and the moral implications of the raids often weighed heavily on the bomber crews. Despite their sense of duty, the airmen were aware of the destruction they were leaving behind. As the bombing raids intensified, many Allied aircrews began to struggle with the psychological toll of their missions. The sight of the flames consuming entire cities and the knowledge that they were part of a campaign that was destroying lives was difficult to bear. While they understood the necessity of the raids from a military standpoint, the human cost was never far from their minds. For some, the war would never be over even after it ended, as they carried the burden of the devastation they had helped bring about. The Allied bombing campaign had a profound impact on German industry, one of the cornerstones of its war effort. Early on, the focus was on destroying factories that produced weapons, tanks, and aircraft, particularly in industrial zones like the Ruhr Valley, which housed many of Germany's critical manufacturing sites. These areas were heavily targeted, and over time, the bombings succeeded in severely damaging or destroying large portions of the industrial infrastructure. The result was a sharp decline in production, particularly in munitions, vehicles, and other key materials required to sustain Germany's military operations. Factories that were once vital to the Nazi war machine became prime targets. Cities like Essen, Düsseldorf, and Cologne were hit hard, as they were home to critical production sites for tanks, aircraft, and artillery. These bombings, while aimed at disrupting the German war effort, had a long-term effect on the country's ability to wage war. The destruction of key industrial sites forced the Germans to shift much of their resources toward rebuilding these factories. However, this was no easy task, and as the bombings continued, it became increasingly difficult for Germany to restore its industrial capacity. Even when factories were rebuilt, they were often targeted again, preventing any real progress. The disruption went beyond just the factories. The Allies focused on transportation hubs, including railroads, bridges, and supply lines, which were crucial to moving raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front lines. The damage to these transportation networks made it harder for Germany to efficiently move resources across the country. Critical supplies, such as fuel and raw materials for manufacturing, were either delayed or never arrived. This breakdown in logistics had a cascading effect, making it harder for the German military to maintain the flow of equipment and supplies needed to fight the war. The impact on the German economy was severe. The country's war machine relied heavily on industrial production to keep up with the demands of the battlefield. With factories destroyed, resources diverted to rebuild, and supply lines disrupted, Germany was forced to stretch its economy thin. The government had to allocate significant resources to rebuild cities that were being bombed into ruins, while at the same time, it had to continue defending against Allied air attacks and maintaining military operations. This diversion of resources drained the country's economy, further limiting its ability to continue fighting effectively. Despite these challenges, Germany tried to rebuild its industrial capacity. However, the bombings constantly set back any efforts to recover. Factories were rebuilt, but they were never fully protected from Allied air raids. As a result, the rebuilding process was slow, and the factories that were restored were not able to operate at full capacity for long. The Allies' continuous attacks prevented Germany from regaining its full industrial strength, leaving it in a weakened state. The inability to keep up with production demands meant that the German military was increasingly ill-equipped to continue its offensive operations. The strain on the German economy and industrial capacity forced the Nazi leadership to alter their military strategy. With their factories destroyed and their supply lines cut off, Germany could no longer afford to focus on offensive operations. The high cost of rebuilding and the constant threat of air raids shifted the focus toward defense. Instead of expanding their territory, the German military was forced to adopt a more defensive stance, particularly on the western and eastern fronts. Resources were diverted to fortify positions and defend critical areas, including the Atlantic Wall, which was meant to protect German-occupied France from an Allied invasion. But even as the Germans focused on defense, the continuous bombing raids made it more difficult to maintain these fortifications. The pressure of defending against air attacks drained the resources needed for both military operations and industrial rebuilding. The strategic consequences of the bombing campaign were significant. The destruction of German industry played a key role in limiting the country's ability to produce the necessary weapons and supplies for its military. As a result, the German military was forced to focus on a defensive strategy, limiting its potential for offense. This shift in strategy, combined with the weakening of Germany's industrial base, set the stage for the eventual invasion of Germany by the Western Allies. The continuous pressure from the bombing raids, along with the opening of the Second Front in 1944, left Germany with fewer resources to defend against the advancing Allied forces. The bombing campaign had weakened Germany's ability to fight back, leaving it vulnerable to the Allied push from both the West and the East. Germany's industrial and economic collapse was evident by 1944. As the Allies advanced, German forces were often underprepared and under-equipped. Their supply lines were in disarray, and they struggled to maintain any significant offensive capabilities. This weakening of Germany's military ability allowed the Allies to continue their push into German-occupied territory, eventually leading to the opening of a second front. By the time the Western Allies launched the invasion in June 1944, Germany's ability to defend itself had been seriously compromised by the sustained bombing campaign. The factories that once powered its war effort were no longer functioning at full capacity, and the country's economy was in ruins. The impact of the bombing campaign on military strategy was clear. With its industrial base crippled, Germany could no longer sustain the same level of military production. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery became harder to produce, and the army was left without the necessary equipment to defend effectively. The shift from offensive to defensive strategies allowed the Allies to gain the upper hand, and the Allied bombing campaign, in many ways, laid the groundwork for the eventual invasion and defeat of Germany. The bombing raids also served as a reminder of the limitations of the German war machine. Despite the initial success of their military campaigns, Germany's dependence on a strong industrial base ultimately proved to be its downfall. The bombings not only weakened its ability to produce weapons and supplies, but also drained the resources needed to defend its borders and maintain the war effort. The economic strain forced Germany to divert resources away from military operations, which only contributed to its eventual collapse. By the time the Allies entered Germany in 1945, the country's war machine had been severely crippled, largely due to the relentless bombing campaign. The strategic bombing campaign in World War II left a complex and often contentious legacy. One of the primary questions raised by the campaign was moral and ethical in nature, particularly regarding the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The deliberate bombing of cities like Dresden, which was not a major industrial target but a city known for its cultural significance, sparked intense debates after the war. The destruction of entire urban areas, including homes, schools, hospitals, and other non-military buildings, led to the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. The sheer scale of the devastation, particularly in raids that created firestorms, raised difficult questions about the morality of targeting cities with large civilian populations. Many critics argued that the bombings went beyond military necessity and became a form of collective punishment. While the Allies justified their actions as a way to weaken Germany's industrial capacity and undermine its war effort, the human cost was enormous. The bombing of Dresden, in particular, remains a focal point of debate, with some questioning whether such tactics were necessary or proportionate, given the widespread civilian casualties. In the aftermath of the war, these moral questions continued to linger. Some believed that the bombings were essential to ending the war more quickly and saving Allied lives. However, others wondered if alternative strategies could have achieved the same objectives without causing such widespread destruction and loss of life. The question of whether the Allies could have focused more on military targets or found ways to limit civilian casualties without compromising the effectiveness of their campaigns remained a topic of debate. Some also raised concerns about the psychological impact on civilians, suggesting that the raids were not only meant to destroy industry, but also to break the spirit of the German population. The long-term psychological scars left on survivors were undeniable, as many were left to rebuild their lives in the ruins of their cities. The impact of the strategic bombing campaign extended far beyond World War II. The effectiveness of the bombing raids in crippling German industry and military capacity influenced post-war military strategies, particularly during the Cold War. The idea of strategic bombing and the concept of overwhelming force became central to nuclear deterrence strategies. The idea that demonstrating overwhelming destructive power could compel an enemy to surrender or back down without direct confrontation became a key principle in Cold War military thinking. This doctrine, often referred to as shock and awe, relied heavily on the ability to strike fast, hard, and from the air. The bombing tactics refined during World War II became a precedent for future military engagements, where air superiority and the ability to deliver precise strikes were seen as vital components of modern warfare. The development of precision-guided munitions and the growing reliance on air forces in post-war conflicts reflected the lessons learned from the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II. The legacy of the bombing raids also left a significant mark on urban areas and the post-war reconstruction efforts in Germany. Cities that had once been thriving centers of industry, culture, and life were left in ruins. The Ruhr Valley, which had been a key industrial heartland, lay in tatters. Major cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin faced the enormous task of rebuilding not just their infrastructure, but also the social fabric that had been shattered. The physical destruction of cities was accompanied by the emotional toll on their citizens. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, homes lost, and family members killed. Rebuilding efforts took years, and the scars of the war remained visible long after the fighting had ended. The psychological effects of the bombings lingered for decades, as survivors struggled to reconcile their experiences and rebuild their lives amidst the rubble. The destruction of cultural landmarks, like the Frauenkirche in Dresden and the historic center of Hamburg, added to the sense of loss. These cities had long been symbols of Germany's cultural and architectural heritage, and their destruction left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the German people. The loss was not just physical but also cultural, as cities were forced to rebuild not only their buildings but also their identities. The devastation brought by the bombing raids raised questions about the preservation of culture during wartime and whether such destruction could ever be justified, even for military purposes. In Germany's post-war identity, the effects of the bombing campaigns were undeniable. The country had to come to terms with both the physical destruction it had endured and the role it had played in the war. The bombings were part of the larger narrative of Germany's defeat, but they also became a symbol of the suffering experienced by civilians during the conflict. Many Germans felt that they had been subjected to a form of collective punishment, while others grappled with the emotional burden of their country's actions during the war. This tension shaped Germany's post-war identity, as the country tried to reconcile the devastation it had faced with the legacy of the war. The bombings also influenced how the world viewed the role of civilians in wartime. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants became more blurred as the scale of the destruction and the number of civilian casualties became clear. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II set a precedent for future conflicts, where civilians often found themselves caught in the crossfire. The ethical implications of targeting civilian populations would continue to be discussed in later wars, as the line between military objectives and civilian safety remained a contentious issue. The long-term psychological impact on the survivors of the bombing raids cannot be overstated. Many people who lived through the bombings struggled with post-traumatic stress for years, if not decades. The constant threat of death, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of homes and communities left lasting scars. These experiences affected not only the immediate survivors but also the generations that followed. Children who grew up in the aftermath of the bombings often carried the trauma of their parents, and the collective memory of the destruction shaped the culture of post-war Germany. In the end, the legacy of the strategic bombing campaign in World War II is complex and multifaceted. While it played a significant role in weakening Germany's ability to fight, it also raised moral questions about the conduct of war and the treatment of civilians. The physical and psychological toll of the bombings on the German people shaped the country's post-war identity and influenced military strategies for years to come. The question of how to balance military objectives with the protection of civilians remains a key issue in the conduct of modern warfare, with the bombing campaigns of World War II continuing to serve as a painful reminder of the costs of war.